Good morning, everyone. We're going to start with a lecture that will provide the context of the beginning of the panel. I would like to thank Amexipac for considering me as part of the lectures. I'm very passionate of this topic, and I would like you to perceive the same conviction that we have in the tax administration service so that we can use the technologies to do a better work. Our country in 2013 designed a tax reform that started to be in effect in 2014, a tax reform where two premises were considered: increasing the taxpayers' base, that is, more people paying taxes. And I would like to say that taxpayers were already paying taxes. They were already in an activity. They were getting income, but they were not paying taxes. So we wanted to increase the amount of taxpayers. So we want people to pay more if they have the obligation to do so. The basis to calculate taxes was wider. So some changes were made to the income tax. The entrepreneurial unique rate IETU was abrogated. Also, the cash deposit law was abrogated. These two laws wanted to generate some self-control to income tax, an income tax that was pulverized, that had lost progressiveness, that an income tax should have, and also changes were made to the VAT. Under this framework, the objective of the tax reform was to foster in all our actions the willing compliance of taxpayers by establishing conditions that people that are getting an income and that are not paying taxes could start paying taxes. And for this purpose, the challenge of SAT was to facilitate the people that were having an income, all the process to register, to the accounting process, the process of meeting their obligations in an easier manner, and also increasing risk perception of the people that were not paying taxes. That the authority would be firm if they did not comply with their obligations. So voluntary compliance, reducing the processes, making easier pay taxes, making easier meeting the obligations. And on the other hand, the authority will be firm for enforcing law for the people that are not paying taxes. Under these considerations, some due to the fiscal aspects of widening the taxpayer basis, and on the other hand, facilitating the taxpayer the compliance of their fiscal obligations and enforcing laws without any distinction or discretion. We have a cycle, a fiscal cycle. That's how we identify. In this fiscal reform, we have to acknowledge something that is obvious. There is a segment of taxpayers that pay their taxes on timely basis, even though things are complicated. The taxpayer is formal and complies with his or her obligations. Fortunately, they are the majority, and there is another sector of taxpayers that want to comply, but sometimes the conditions do not allow them to comply because the amount of taxes that have to be paid is high because it's a complicated process. And there is another sector that complies if there's an audit, if there is a requirement from the authority. As soon as the authority gets to that person or to that company, then they start complying. And there is another sector that even though taxes are very small, they don't want to pay those taxes, that they don't want to comply with their obligations. They have made the decision not to pay their taxes. Under these 3-4 sectors, the tax administration makes decisions and understands this fiscal cycle, and these decisions are made for these 4 different sectors. In Mexico, we all have the obligation to comply with our obligations to pay taxes. This is a fiscal obligation we all have, and that has to be met in all the world. What do we have to do? So if you have the obligation to pay your taxes, you have to be part of the taxpayer registry. And that's where we started making changes. That was the first major change. In order to register, you have to do it through internet, and we have to do it in a very simple manner. This is where the technological tools started working for the fiscal administration with a CURP, the Unique Population ID. This CURP is the ID, the national ID for every Mexican citizen. So a citizen with a CURP, with a CURP, can register to the taxpayer registry without having to go to an SAT office. You get your tax ID, and unless you have to generate invoices, you have to conclude this in the tax administration service to get the generals, that is fingerprints and eye prints, and a certificate. A digital certificate is given as well as a specific ID, tax ID. These 2 are very important for the use of technologies. So registering is very simple. This may seem elementary, but this is where this forum of digital taxation allows us to get to many of the initiatives we are doing in SAT. So what does the registry have to do with the digital taxation? We have to have a registry, and the registry has to be very simple to build. In December 2012, in our country, we had 38 million people. As of March 2014, we have 42 million. So we went from 38 to 42 million taxpayers in 15 months. This is a universe of taxpayers that had access of the registry through technology. Why? Because we had to take that unique code for population ID, and in our internal processes, we had to go to the National Population Registry, identify that unique population ID is correct, that there is proof of life, and then we created the tax ID. The taxpayer does not see all these transactions that are done through the SAT. Once the taxpayer fills out the unique population ID, automatically you get populated all the information associated with the CURP. This is not a database that is updated by the SAT, because this has to do with some other government agency. And this population service agency is connected to SAT. And through this technological link, that's how we collect all this information, and we have all the elements we need to be able to create the tax ID. The next process, receiving tax returns and payments. Receiving tax returns and payments through for easy tools, so that the taxpayer can have different types of methods to pay through credit cards, any charges to his or her account. Taxpayers may be able to pay in businesses that open from Monday to Friday to Sunday, and some of them 7/24, and they use a line of entering information, and at the supermarket cashier, this information is read and the tax is paid right there. And the authority in the next day gets this information and the layout of the people that have paid and the concepts that were paid just the following day. And this multiplies the payment points, so they can go to the bank, they can go to the websites of the banks, or to the department stores that have several cashiers where the taxes may be paid. What does this allow us to do? We have the taxpayer that is subject to certain obligations. We have the taxpayer that is regulated and surveilled. If the taxpayer has filed the tax return with the tax ID and electronic tax return receipts, we can surveil or supervise if they are paying their taxes. If they are not doing so, we can generate a requirement through technology. In all these actions, there are some tools that we started using this year. These requirements, as of last year, were generated through email, first as an invitation letter, then as a suggestion letter, and now you're going to start getting that through an electronic inbox. The only way the taxpayer will be able to find this information, it can be a requirement and a clarification of a credit or something, and this is the only way. For instance, a request to get back some taxes from VAT, an electronic invoice, or any electronic document that or process that has to be given. What is the difference between this tax box or email? This tax mailbox can be done through anyone that has this advanced electronic signature. And this allows the taxpayer to have access to all the information that the SAT has. Through this fiscal mailbox, in less than 2 years, we will be able to see the behavior of payment per month and per tax compared to what it is happening this year versus the previous year. And there's going to be a fiscal clinical history of compliance. And this will be like the snapshot, and the taxpayer will be able to access this mailbox through the advanced signature. This will be the fiscal document with everything related to this taxpayer. We will be able to surveil the taxpayer in a faster and more accurate manner, and we will start giving rise of the surveillance coverage, a wider surveillance coverage, and the opportunity of this coverage will be the closest to the deadline for complying the obligations, audits. If we have portals or electronic websites where the taxpayer has electronic services, or if we have the payment of taxes in an electronic manner, if we have tax return through an electronic means, or if we have a fiscal mailbox, advanced signature, electronic invoicing, we will be able to have electronic audits as well. Further on, when I talk about the electronic billing or invoicing, we'll see the advantages of the private sector and the use of the authority of this information. But an advantage for regulating, today we carry out 40,000 face-to-face audits. An auditor goes to the address and domicile of the taxpayer and checks the accounting, and implies moving to one address and implies checking all these hard copies. These can be done in the future in an electronic manner through behavior patterns. We will be able to identify the taxpayer with an atypical or abnormal behavior, to see through an electronic inspection, a tax return filing, or an audit. We were going to widen the coverage of regulation and surveillance of SAT. The authority is also obliged to provide easier ways of doing things, more transparency and more openness on how we treat taxpayers. And now we have a figure that no other tax figure has. In Mexico, if a taxpayer is being audited, before the audit concludes, there can be a conclusive agreement with the authority. For instance, we're going to sit both at the table with a protecting intermediary that with protocol, which is the intermediary. And before we get to a charge or to a credit, it may be impugnated. It can be taken to trial. And this will allow that the fiscal interest or credit can take 5 or 6 years. Instead of going to a legal resource, we can get to an administrative resource with a very clear process where the taxpayer can invoke to reach an agreement with the authority and agree all these differences with the tax service. In the cases that have been addressed, we have 77% efficiency in benefit of the taxpayer because the taxpayer accepted the conclusive agreement. And this doesn't mean that he was completely right, but it means that we were able to clarify the authorities' observation or comment. We were able to clarify the difference of the taxpayer with the authority, and we addressed it. And the taxpayer self-corrects himself or herself without going to trial. Compliance is mandatory. Before, the partners of a company had to give the social capital or equity of the company. There were companies with a very small equity, and the stockholder only responded to the amount or the percentage of equity. As of today, the stockholder will respond up to the value of the stock in the total debt. What does this mean? That we can transcend to its property, to his or her property, not only to the equity of the company. This measure may seem too aggressive, but it's part of a premise. The premise is that it is applicable to the person that is a fiscal debtor. This is not activated for the person that is currently paying his or her taxes. The person that complies the rules with the rules and competes in the market with advantages such as quality in the product or service, profitability or productivity will not be affected. But if there is a company that is looking for a competitive advantage by not paying taxes, the authority will detect that company. The company will be sanctioned, and we have to transcend to the consequence of the person that has not complied with his or her obligations for Mexico and for the private sector actors that want to comply with their obligations. Our collection process. The collection process took many years before. Approximately, in the best case scenario, almost a year, 280 days. In the worst case scenario, if the taxpayer, through administrative process, contested a statement, took us almost 2 or 3 years. And once we won, we have to see if there were goods or real estate to be able to recover that fiscal interest. The statistic is hard. From all those credits that are contested by a taxpayer, 45% is won by the authority. We have, from out of that 57% that we won, we were only able to recover by 100% of what the taxpayer owned. 2 of every 100 cases. What does that mean? That there was an impunity factor. That even though this was in a trial, and if we wanted to recover the money from the debt, the taxpayer did not have any money at all to pay the tax. So we included a shorter process, and we reduced the times for collection to 50%, and there are other measurements. The consequences are greater now. The fiscal secret is not a secret anymore, and that fiscal reserve is only given for those that are complying with their obligations, because this is for the people that are actually paying their taxes. So the fiscal secret does not apply for the people or the companies that are not paying taxes. The fiscal secret continues for the people or the companies that are actually paying paying taxes. And the economic actor, that is the one that is paying taxes, that is subject to the rules, will be able to identify who's not doing it and can be isolated and avoiding a fiscal contingency. As of this year, we have published more than 113,000 taxpayers with their name and tax ID, so that the private sector makes the decision if they're going to have a fiscal contingency and have a business with a company or people that are not actually paying their taxes. That's the way we identify many of the actions for 2014 derived from the tax reform. So what is the role that the proceedings and the new technology play? Well, we have electronic registration, electronic tax return, electronic accounting, electronic billing, electronic signature, electronic payments, tax mailbox that started to be in effect on June 30th, accounting as of May for companies and individuals to upload the balance of the total accounting. And next, we're going to start using all these tools for electronic inspections. Everything has an adjective. Everything has to do with electronic. We have to use at the maximum the new technologies to facilitate the taxpayer to pay taxes and also to facilitate authorities to regulate and put in practice their powers. Electronic billing, it started at the middle of 2014. It was a gradual process. We've been in this for 2 years, and it became, on the 10th year, it became mandatory for everyone. At the beginning, was optional. At the beginning, there were approved suppliers for certification and also self-sealing. So the taxpayer may assign the folio number, the digital seal, and remittance of information that has to be provided to the authority. That's how electronic billing started. So you could select as a supplier or do it himself or herself. If an approved supplier of certification was selected, well, a seal was provided by that supplier, and if the taxpayer decided to do it himself or herself, that information has to be provided on monthly basis. Characteristics of our invoice. It's a technological standard. All invoices are the same. They have the same technological standard. They are uniform and they all have fiscal validity. So there were two types of documents: paper, hard copies by 90%, and electronic invoice 10%. The ones that started with this pilot were taxpayers that wanted to become part of the electronic invoice. So what are the factors that encourage them to become part of the electronic invoice universe? Well, first of all, because they were saving money, and they also were simplifying their processes, and that encouraged them to migrate to electronic invoicing. It wasn't mandatory and it wasn't forced by the authority. The authority proposed electronic invoicing and some of them adopted in a voluntary manner. What happened in 2011? Well, in 2011, 7 years later, after beginning the use of electronic invoicing, a new questioning started. Why? Because electronic progress was going to be used. We already have a lot of database and we had many approved suppliers of certification, so that fiscal seal should not be given every month. There was no need of that, and that could be generated online. So we started with the digital receipt through internet. It's the fiscal digital receipt through internet, not only digital, but fiscal and digital through internet. We simplified access for digital fiscal receipts, and we have to calibrate, and we had to open this aspect and this spectrum, so more people were convinced to use electronic invoicing. And 3 years ago, we still had 3 different receipts: the hard copy, the fiscal digital receipt that included a self-sealing, the same emitter or it was invoice emitter included a seal, and then we had the digital fiscal receipt through internet, that is an online fiscal digital through suppliers, approved suppliers of certification, 2014. So what is the characteristics the characteristic of 2014. Everything is online. All that fiscal digital receipts are online. All of them are electronic. Now it's universal, it's mandatory, and there's nothing that may be deducted with regards to income tax if it is not supported with a fiscal digital receipt. Nothing can be deducted if there isn't a fiscal digital receipt. It transcends to payments with a different nature. This electronic invoice started with these transactions in the private sector that allow them to have digital documents that may be recognized with all the fiscal validity in a very simple manner, and it transcended to other types of transactions. For instance, the payroll. The payroll is not a commercial act per se, but it's a way you prove a service provided, and now the payroll has become part of the electronic receipts. The public entities, the public sector, the government, for every transaction where some income is received, every money that is received by the government may sometimes be deducted by taxpayers. For instance, industry, the use of industrial water can be deducted. For instance, for power, the use of that power for industrial and commercial consumption may also be deducted by a taxpayer because they are a basic or essential expenditure for their business. So those have to be supported with a fiscal digital online receipt in order to be deductible. Otherwise, it cannot be deducted. Civil associations that have a social purpose, that become donors, and that can also receive donations. If it's not supported through a fiscal digital receipt, it cannot be used. That could have been done before on paper, but now it has to be a fiscal digital receipt. As of this month, the Mexican Institute of Social Security, the largest medical provider in Mexico, the fees that are paid to Social Security by the taxpayers, they have to be supported by a fiscal digital receipt online. Why? Because those fees paid by the owner of the company are deductible for tax income purposes. And everything that may be deductible has to be supported by a fiscal digital receipt. So what was the premise of the pilot test? And I'm going to go back to 2004. I put that in italics. And this is what you can see. Some taxpayers uploaded their experience of electronic invoicing, and they had to put into sequence this with their suppliers so they can create some synergies. They optimized human resources. In the examples that you can find internet, the companies reduced by half the human resources used for hard copies, for invoicing in hard copies, and we're also reducing costs of carriers because local carriers can be 20 to 30 pesos, but carriers from one state to another state in Mexico could be up to 55 pesos. So we've been saving money in that regard. The invoice was put into an envelope and it was given to a carrier, and that carrier sent that information. And before we put that into an invoice, it had to be checked by the area that issued issued it, and it had to comply with all the information, the data of of the client. It was printed, a piece of paper was used, and behind that you have all the staff that was responsible for carrying out those tasks, and then that invoice was filed. That invoice was received by the client or the customer. All that information was checked, that all the documents, that all the information was correct, the payment was scheduled, the document was sent back. There are no errors there, but if there's an error, then imagine going back to the same cycle from the very beginning. So there was time spent, that is transporting that invoice, checking that invoice. All that was generating costs to the businesses, to the organization. Costs for printing, costs for that paper, costs for filing, controlling, because you have to collect the number of the carrier, the value, the order that had generated that invoice, the cost of the carrier. If the invoice was lost, we had to go through that process again. The time to validate the invoice. It was common to see in the companies a huge queue for checking the invoices, and it said from this time to this time, from Monday to Friday, or only in one day, and then day scheduling in specific days and hours as well. So the supplier would have to go there to get the invoice checked, and as well as to get the schedule for payment. And that also generated expenses. So what are the benefits in the whole cycle? Nowadays, the company has order placements electronically. That company has electronic orders, stocks, electronic stocks, confirmation or acknowledgement of the order electronically. The invoice, then receipt of the shipment is done electronically. And I'm going to skip the electronic invoice. The payment is done electronically. Most of the times it's done through a wire transfer. No checks are used. The notification is done through the bank, through an email. The confirmation from the bank is also electronic. In that cycle of the business transaction, imagine if that would still be in a hard copy. The suppliers, approved suppliers of certification, not only do they generate the seal or the certificate, they also offer an added value for a company or for a customer. And this integrated or comprehensive cycle includes packs that are offering advantages in how they manage their stocks, their income, their accounting reports. Everything is done through a substantial tool that is the electronic invoice. The advantage of not having warehouses of all these documents and having to look for an invoice in a huge amount or pile of documents. And the thing that is the best, you go in line with a bi-dimensional barcode, and the customer can verify the validity, the authenticity of the invoice in a matter of seconds. If you go out, if you leave this hotel today or tomorrow, your electronic invoice, before you get on your taxi or on the means of transportation that you will be using, will get to your email address. The authenticity and validity of that invoice cannot be disputed. It's completely valid. It also promotes accountability. And this is a call for the people in the private sector. We have to demand that if taxpayers have to use fiscal digital receipts, and citizens have to get the invoice from every product and service purchased, the authority and the citizens have to demand that all public instances, that is federal, local or municipal entities, should be given a fiscal digital receipt. That is the license, the driving license, the birth certificate, payment of power, payment of water. All these services have to be supported through a fiscal digital receipt. Why? Because it generates a new taxation queue of all the people and the entities. And with all these fiscal digital receipts, we can see the income of that public entity. So now we're using technology for transparency of public income. This will allow them very easily to get their public accounting, and they have to present before the Congress their accounting, and this can be supported by fiscal digital receipts that were issued for the payment of those public services. They will be able to record their income per concept. This is, for instance, the payment of water in the house, or for industrial use or for commercial use. This is the concept of electronic for the land taxes, or the regional impact, or this is the right for the taxpayer to to conduct a proceeding before a certain public entity. Something that we cannot deny. It also facilitates regulation and service to taxpayers. It will allow us to make electronic inspections and audits in a faster manner. For instance, with information of a taxpayer from June, we can very rapidly know the amount when all their invoices are added up. If that amount matches the information provided on July 17th that has to do with the month of June. In the field of the tax income and tax income return, and also the VAT has to match the invoices of the expenses, and this may become a timely supervision in less than 1 month. What happened before the use of electronic invoice? We did not have access to the invoice until we had a face-to-face audit. And how often was this done? We do 40,000 per year. In traditional audits, we are checking what happened months from 2 or 3 years ago, still in hard copy. And this tool will allow us to audit the following month. A tax return was filed. And what we can see, for instance, is that this person is actually paying taxes but is not paying taxes properly. We're going to have to be more accurate to detect frauds. We are also going to know the control of investment and expenses of people that are getting income but not paying taxes. There are people that say that they have a debt with SAT, but they don't have any property. And that allows us to identify that person that says that has no property on his or her name, when that person or company has an electronic invoice of a good or property that was purchased one day before, the collecting system detects it right away. I see that you have an invoice of a good, and many times these invoices is a document that accredits the property of that good. So what would that allow us to do? For instance, if we have the value of the acts, the accrued values, then the information will be pre-populated, and with the Mexican fiscal administration, that tax return may be edited, but we can induce part of the information and pre-populate the fields. And on the other hand, we can start eliminating the informative tax returns if we have the electronic invoices, and if we have all that electronic tax returns, we will have informative, we will not need to have informative returns, and that will not be part of the obligations. We have 38 suppliers, approved suppliers. Over 99% of electronic invoicing is done through them. In 2011, we generated 119 million digital electronic invoices. 119. In 2012, 48.5 million. In 2013, 1.9 billion invoices. From January to June 2014, 2.4 billion electronic invoices, 24 times more than what we did in 2011. In just 1 month, from January to June 2014, 401 million invoices are sealed. That is, in 1 month, we do what was done in 2011. This is the exponential growth of the electronic invoices. How many electronic invoices are we going to have by 2014? Over 5 billion. So what is, we have 12 billion electronic invoices. All of the transactions, all the commercial transactions, all the transactions that may be deducted, all the transactions that include VAT or that have that fiscal nature are supported by a fiscal digital receipt by internet. And all these electronic invoices are online, provided by SIT. Nobody has to put in a file that information and send that information to SIT. As soon as that information is sealed, the server of the SIT database has the invoices of all the taxpayers that are currently making that transaction. How do we have now? 3.3. How many did we have in 2012? 750,000. Now we have 3.3 million. How many should they have? This over 7 million. Many of them, because of their income nature, because it's not on regular basis, they have to become emitters, invoice emitters. Most 3.3 million emitters are more recurrent in the use of these fiscal and digital receipts. Something that I would like to mention is that approved suppliers of certification went from being a figure that certified and sealed invoices to being an added value supplier for private sectors. Their tools today are not only for sealing or certification purposes. Nowadays, within that tool, they support stock control, order placements, income reports per sales, a series of added values related to electronic invoicing, price control, etc. The private sector in this task of electronic invoicing, use of new technologies, digital taxation has been a basic partner. We were able to have coverage for sealing, having more points for sealing. It also allows us to address the investment in a faster manner because the investment was made by them. They have this approved technology that is regulated by SAT to be able to seal the fiscal and digital receipts. Now, thanks to the approved suppliers in certification, thanks to that partnership with these suppliers, the taxpayers have a very fast electronic invoicing system. It's done online, and as of today, we can know how much you're spending in a business if you decided to get an electronic invoice. And if any of you yesterday you purchased a vehicle, the SAT knows it. That's the advantage of using new technologies. That's the advantage of having electronic billing or invoicing. So what's next? This is what we currently have, and we cannot be left behind, and we cannot stay where we are. Let me give you an example of what is next. It's mandatory. It's unavoidable. The tax administrators have to reach an agreement in order to verify if a merchandise that comes from abroad has the value that is reported by the broker, and that value is real, and that document that supports the purchasing of that merchandise abroad is real, then the basic tool that has to be used is the electronic invoice, because now that electronic invoice that has a barcode can be read in a device like this, and it goes immediately to the SAT database and confirms that that invoice that you have on paper is identical to the one that the tax administration has. How would this benefit international trading? Because the documents presented at customs can be verified through reading bidimensional barcodes to acknowledge if that the exporter, the exporter convalidates the information that is provided by the importer in Mexico. So what does this lead us to? If we have initiatives of exchanging information, if we have partnerships to collaborate and to collect debts from people that are living abroad, then it will be mandatory to have technological standards to adopt an electronic invoice that can become a standard in all these countries. And then we will start achieving all these benefits. And for the customers and for the private sector, that will be an advantage in savings and economies, as it has been shown in the private sector through the information that is posted in internet with regards to the advantages provided through electronic invoice. So we want an international standard with the same requirements for the electronic invoice, and that can become a regulation and facilitation tool in international trading. But specifically, that can generate savings for economic stakeholders. As this, there is a series of initiatives that can happen in tax administration by using technology. We are convinced that electronic invoice is here to stay. It's moving forward, and it will be an essential tool for tax administration, income forecasting, and regulation of taxpayers, as well as compliance of taxpayers. And it is an example of saving money and saving resources, as the private sector has mentioned. It generates lots of savings, it facilitates transactions, and that's a great experience that we have in Mexico after 10 years of starting this such adventure of starting using fiscal digital receipts that are now online for every transaction that can be deducted in Mexico. Thank you very much.